Ma'am, it's audible.
Okay. Good afternoon, all. It's given me a great pleasure to welcome our special guest speaker of the day, Dr. Alex M. Thomas, Assistant Professor, Azim Premji University, Bangalore. Dr. Alex studied economics at the universities of Madras, Hyderabad, and Sydney. His primary area of research is the history of economic thought. He has published his research in both national and international journals such as Arthavignana, Economic and Political Weekly, History of Economic Ideas, History of Economic Review, and Journal of Interdisciplinary Economics. His co-edited book on the history of economic thought was published by Routledge in 2019. His book Macroeconomics and Introductions will be published by Cambridge University Press in early 2021. Let us welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Alex M. Thomas. He will discuss in his expert opinion on the topic classical political economy, theories of value, distribution, and growth. I ask that you give your full attention to Dr. Alex M. Thomas and help me in welcoming him to this session. Dr. Alex Thomas, sir, please continue your session. Please, sir.
Uh, Thank you. I'll just open the PowerPoint. Also, can you tell me if I'm audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Just give me a minute. Okay, I thought that I knew how to do this, but I'll just find out. Just give me 2 minutes. Okay, while the slides are being uploaded, I would like to thank Sri Shankara College, especially the Department of Economics, for inviting me here. And in particular, I would like to thank Prasad sir for all the support. And I think we have had so many repeated meetings and emails throughout the last 1 month. So I, give my wholehearted thanks to him. I also thank Hemant Kumar sir for his broad overview. I think that has given some sort of perspective on what I will talk about. And I would also like to thank Dr. Anumol ma'am for her introduction. How is the audio? Is the audio fine? Can I?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you. All right. So today I'm going to talk about classical political economy, theories of value, distribution, and growth. So first of all, I want to point out that sometimes when students and even teachers come across classical economics, there is a confusion because Keynes, when he wrote the general theory, he classified everybody before him in a chronological way to be classical economics. And this kind of a problematic classification, which is a chronological classification, exists even today in most macroeconomics textbooks. So students are always confused, and even we are confused. What is the meaning of classical economics? Because macroeconomics textbooks portray a chronological classification, which I think is really wrong. Wrong in the sense of analytically, it is unsatisfactory. And the reason for this is Keynes has classified people like Alfred Marshall, Arthur Pigou, David Ricardo, Adam Smith all under one category. And there is a problem there. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So let me just give you a sense of broadly, there are many analytical approaches to study economics. I think Hemant Kumar sir mentioned some of it, but I'm going to go a little more deeper into some of it. The most dominant one is what is called the marginalist approach, or it is also called neoclassical approach. It is also called mainstream economics. It is also orthodox economics. But what are some of the key characteristics of it? One is methodological individualism. That is, the fundamental unit of analysis is an individual. Uh, can I please ask participants to mute their mics because I can hear? I think there are some mics which are probably on and that I can hear sounds. Thank you. Yeah. The second point about marginalist approach is they use terms such as marginal cost, marginal product, marginal revenue. The income distribution is understood and determined by the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. In the 1870s, the key people to develop this approach was Jevons, Walras, and Menger. Later, the work was carried on by Alfred Marshall, Arthur Pigou, and in the 20th century, you have people like Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Romer and Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize in 2019. All of them follow the marginalist approach. Now, what about economists, Indian economists, like Amartya Sen, Kaushik Basu, and Jagdish Bhagwati? All three of them also follow the marginalist approach or the neoclassical approach. And textbooks like Mankiw and Varian also follow the marginalist or the neoclassical approach. So it is very difficult, in fact, to come across an approach that is not very much there. And in fact, I must point out that when I was studying my BA economics in Chennai, there was no way for us to be introduced to something different. It was only later when I went to study at the University of Hyderabad that we were introduced to something alternative. So I think that it is really a welcome move that MG University has done to introduce this course to all of you. The second approach, this can be called the surplus approach. This is because these economists, I'll talk about who the economists are. They believe that the economy produces a surplus, and they wanted to find out how that surplus is produced, distributed, and consumed. The fundamental unit of analysis in this analytical approach or the surplus approach is social classes, and therefore this is termed as methodological holism. Some of the key economists who developed this approach is Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx, and then in the 1960s or in the 20th century, Piero Sraffa revived the economics that is emanating from the surplus approach. After Sraffa revived it, we have people like Garignani, Pasinetti, and closer to home, Krishna Bharadwaj, who also set up the center for the CESP center at JNU. She was instrumental in working on this kind of a tradition. Now, this is also crudely called heterodox economics. This falls under heterodox economics. Sometimes people call it Sraffian economics, and sometimes people call it Neo-Ricardian economics. I don't want to call it Sraffian economics or Neo-Ricardian economics because it is important to engage with key elements which have been provided by economists like Smith, Malthus, and Marx. And I think Sraffian economics or Neo-Ricardian economics is too limiting to contain all this. So I'm going to stick to calling it classical economics or classical political economy or the surplus approach. Now, there are other analytical approaches too, which can be broadly called as heterodox economics. One of them is Marxian political economy, and the other is post-Keynesian economics. And in the subsequent days, I think aspects of this will be covered. Before I tell you the outline of today's talk, I just want to point out that Keynes exists in various analytical approaches. So what we generally study in textbooks is the marginalist Keynesian approach, which is understood in the form of ISLM. And this is really Hicks. This is really Hicks trying to interpret Keynes in a marginalist fashion. Now, what is called, sometimes there are developments in this area, which is called New Keynesian economics. And they talk about imperfections referring to some sort of rigidities. It could be information asymmetry. So economists like Stiglitz work in this sort of imperfectionist or imperfectionist economics. All this falls within the marginalist Keynesian camp. Then you have the classical Keynesian, which is the classical economics plus the Keynesian idea. They take the classical theory of value and distribution as revived by Sraffa, and they use Keynes's principle of effective demand. And this together contributes what might be called demand-led growth theory. Now, there's a third area, the third sort of broad research program, which is Kalecki and Keynesian's put together. Sometimes they have overlaps with the classical Keynesian school, but sometimes there is a distinction. And broadly, this can be called post-Keynesian economics. So this is the outline of the session, or this is what I had in mind. I mean, I didn't think, maybe there is some constraint on time, but I'll see how we can go about it. But what I planned initially was to go through part one, break for about 10 minutes, take question Q&A, then start part two. So we'll see how we go. If depending on how the time is, I'll make a decision. Okay, so we talk of why do I talk about theories of value distribution and growth, and how do I understand it? So the first thing is that value or price theory really falls within the domain of microeconomics. Although you will notice that when you teach microeconomics, we only teach them neoclassical or marginalist microeconomics. And I would ask the question, why is it that we don't teach an alternative microeconomics when students are exposed to microeconomics itself? The theory of income distribution also broadly falls within the domain of microeconomics, but students only learn marginal productivity theory of income distribution. The domain of growth theory broadly is generally taught in curriculum in macroeconomics or economic development, or you might have a growth theory paper. So this is the reason that I decided to focus on theories of value distribution and growth, because one, some of these aspects can go into heterodox economics, but some of this can easily be used in the teaching of microeconomics, macro and macroeconomics too. So the question is, I mean, sometimes students ask this question too, why theory of value? So why should we be interested in determining P as prices or P1 by P2, which is relative prices? Why should we be interested in this question? For classical economists, they wanted to understand economic growth and development. And in order to understand the evolution of output, that is why, they needed to have some understanding of what determines P. They needed to have some understanding of what determines P and also what determines output, Q. So this is the fundamental reason why, if you look at Wealth of Nations or Principles of Political Economy, a lot of them, most of them who are writing in the classical tradition give a lot of importance to the theory of value or the value question. And in a way, you cannot really have a coherent or consistent economic theory without having a theory of value. It has to be there because you have to determine P in some way or the other. This debate also took place within the context of what determines use value, what determines exchange value. So for the marginalist school or for the neoclassical school, they argued that exchange value is determined by use value. In other words, they have a subjective theory of value which can be traced to utility. And what is interesting today is sometimes when I ask people, what does microeconomic theory explain? No longer do they tell me that it explains price theory. They tell me that it explains human behavior or it is a science of choice. So it's interesting how marginalist economics is pitching itself, and not, at least in microeconomics, not fundamentally as a theory of value, but as a science or a theory of human behavior. And this is much more recent change. Whereas for classical economists, they have an objective theory of value. What do I mean by objective? I'm talking about measurements which can be objectively made, and it is not dependent on how the individual feels or thinks about utility. So for classical economists, they have tried to understand theory or value by recourse to land, by, that is, the acres of land that go into the production of a commodity, or the quantity of labor that goes into the production of a commodity directly or and indirectly. So this is why I call it an objective theory of value as opposed to a subjective theory of value, which is found in neoclassical economics. So now let me get on to Smith's theory of value. Smith makes a distinction between natural prices and market prices. So market prices are prices that we are able to observe in a way. But he says that we cannot really theorize market prices. So in order to theorize or in order to understand these prices, we have to study natural prices, and these are theoretical prices. So for Smith, natural prices and the notion of effectual demand are tied to each other. So effectual demand is something that is sort of given from outside. So there is, I mean, when Smith is trying to understand value theory, he is not trying to determine effectual demand. At this point, I would like to sort of draw your attention to how neoclassical economics does it. For neoclassical economics, when you're trying to determine the commodity price, what you notice is both prices and quantities are simultaneously determined. Let me repeat that. Both prices and quantities are simultaneously determined, whereas in Smith and other classical economists, you will not find such a simultaneous determination. The other thing is in neoclassical economics, there is a symmetry between supply and demand. Whereas in classical economics, and in particular in Smith's case, what you see is that supply adapts to demand. The other important context in which Smith sets up his theory of value is the idea of free competition. Now, this free competition notion. I think somebody's mic is on.
Participants are please requested to switch off your microphones, please.
Yeah, so the context in which Smith is talking about value theory is the notion of free competition. And this is different from the sort of static understanding of competition that is there in marginalist economics, because there you have to impose very undynamic or non-dynamic rules like firms are price takers. I mean, no true notion of competition is it where you think that firms have no role to play. So this notion of free competition is different from that. All that Smith and other classical economists are assuming is that there should be free mobility of labor and capital. And this ensures that market prices will gravitate towards natural prices. So Smith's theory of value is sometimes in the literature called the adding up theory of value. That is what Smith did was he had a determination of wages, of profits and rent. And then he said that the price of a commodity, to find out the price of that commodity, you add up all these individual income distribution components. People usually try to argue that, or it is argued that Smith's theory of value is labor commanded in nature, whereas as opposed to Ricardo's theory of value, where it is labor embodied. And so, given the interest of time, and given that this is going to be a course, some of the things I'm not going to go in depth, but some others I will go in depth. For instance, labor commanded and labor embodied is well written about in the literature, so I'm not going to go so much in detail about that. What about wages? And I think this is a very important thing, because in neoclassical economics, wages are determined in equilibrium by the marginal product of labor. So it is completely endogenously determined in the labor market through the demand and supply of labor, the graphs. Whereas Smith is saying that wages or real wages are not determined like that. Real wages are exogenously determined. They are historically determined. They are culturally determined. And this is where he brings in the notion of subsistence wages. It is a customary notion. It depends on convention. And it's not a biological minimum. So it's not a calorie count, but it is much more conventionally determined. And profits, I mean, Smith does not really talk about so much about how profits are determined, but what is important in Smith is that he gives a nice account of how there is a tendency for profits to be uniform across all sectors. What about Smith's theory of growth? And again, this is a question that I sometimes ask my students. Why is it that when we teach growth theory, we start with Solow, or at the most, we start with Harrod? We don't talk about Marx. Marx also has a theory of growth or business cycles. We don't talk about Smith. Smith also has a theory of growth and economic development, and so does Ricardo. Why is it that growth theory always begins with a Harrod or Solow? And the only reason is that it is because it is marginalist economics. If you were to look at economics much more widely, I think that there will be enough reasons to introduce students to other approaches. So in Smith's theory of growth, there are three things which are important. One is so talking about Smith's theory of growth, I think there are three aspects which are important. One is the notion of division of labor, where he talks of technological improvements. In a crude sense, you can understand it as increasing returns. The second point is he talks of the importance of net saving or accumulation. And the way in which Smith talks about it is by using the terms productive labor. So if you have more productive labor, it is akin to or it is equivalent to thinking about how contemporary economists think about increasing net saving or net investment. And in Smith, saving or planned saving was planned saving is understood as investment. And the third point, and this point is often not really mentioned in the literature, which is that Smith also talks about how division of labor is constrained by the extent of the market. And this notion of extent of the market, in a way, can be understood in some way as a kind of Keynesian idea of aggregate demand. And so Smith is saying that you can keep on having technological progress, but as long as there is not enough aggregate demand, there is no point because you cannot grow further. Okay, so again, the same thing has happened. I think somebody else has again taken control over the slide. Okay, so I don't know what to do. Is there some way in which only I have access to the slide? If somebody knows how to solve that problem.
Professor, sir.
I'm sure maybe there is some specification whereby only the speaker has access to the PowerPoint. Let me just see if I have any access. I don't think so. Yeah, I'm not sure. Is it visible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay, so this is about Smith's theory of growth. So this is not really part of growth theory, etc. But I thought I want to mention this because of how misrepresented Adam Smith is in general, whether it is in textbooks or whether it's in newspapers. And mostly it's because people haven't really read Adam Smith's work, which is not just The Wealth of Nations, which is what economists generally read, but also his theory of moral sentiments, which was written before The Wealth of Nations. In fact, what you notice is that in the context of education, and this is I've just put a screenshot of the article that I wrote on this, which is Adam Smith on the philosophy and provision of education, where I argue that if you read Theory of Moral Sentiments and Wealth of Nations, it is very clear that Smith gave a very important role for the state. In fact, education is seen as a necessary good. It is not something like neoclassical economics. It is not that, okay, the market cannot provide, so therefore let the state provide. It is not like that. For Smith, it is very clear that it is a necessary good for everyone. And therefore, it has to be somehow partly provided by the state. Now, the second point is again a misunderstanding is people use invisible hand and Smith as if Smith is talking about the free market in the way we understand it today. And that is also a very wrong interpretation of invisible hand and of I'll go ahead. Yeah, so invisible hand, when Adam Smith is talking about invisible hand, all that he has in mind is unintended consequences. Right? So he's talking about how sometimes people do certain things which lead to some other kind of consequences. And from this notion of invisible hand, there is no way in which one can argue that Adam Smith is a free market economist as we understand free markets today. Okay, with that, let me move to Ricardo's theory of value. Ricardo also distinguishes between natural prices and market prices, and Ricardo also has a notion of effectual demand. In Ricardo, the labor theory of value is much more clearer, and he is talking about and value is determined by the labor that is embodied in these commodities. What about Ricardo's theory of income distribution? In Ricardo's theory of, for Ricardo, wages, just like in Smith, are determined by customary subsistence. So habit is a cultural and a historically determined variable that has a role to play in real wages. Education also has a positive role to play in real wages. So these education is considered to be an essential and a necessary aspect of real wages. There is no way in which you can, according to these economists, there is no way you can separate out education from the question of real wages or what is important for workers or what goes into customary subsistence. Ricardo also has an interpretation of rate of profit, and this is interesting, and this is where he differs from Adam Smith, because for Ricardo, real wages and the rate of profit are inversely related. So W equals 1 by R. It talks of an inverse relationship. What it also means is that there is a conflictual relationship between workers and capitalists. Again, at this point, I would like to highlight the fact that in neoclassical economics, when one studies the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, what you have is a very harmonious account of wages. Everyone is compensated according to what they contribute. Whereas Ricardo's theory of income distribution is arguing that no, in capitalism, what you have is actually a conflictual relationship between workers and capitalists. Now let me move on to Ricardo's theory of growth. Again, there are three aspects and which is important for Ricardo. One is the notion of diminishing returns to land. Now, land can be broadly understood as natural resources or ecological resources. It was clear that if you go on producing more and more output or do more and more farming on the same piece of land, that is one way in which you can have a reduction of fertility. And therefore, Ricardo spoke about diminishing returns to land. But what happened later, what the marginalist economists did, and particularly Alfred Marshall, is they extended this notion of diminishing returns to all other factors of production. They said that diminishing returns does not just operate to land, but it is also in the case of labor, it is also in the case of capital. And to do this, they had to do various other adjustments. But fundamentally, this seems to be an illegitimate extension of this idea that was first there in Ricardo. Ricardo also, similar to Adam Smith, argued that you need to have an increase in net saving or net accumulation to have economic growth. But Ricardo also somehow believed in the Say's law. Say's law, which says that supply creates its own demand. Although, what is interesting is that in Ricardo, you will notice that there are some elements or aspects where he seems to think that demand is also important. So, in some sense, one can say that there is some kind of an inconsistency. Now, let me move on to Marx's theory of value. And I think before entering Marx's theory of value, it is important to point out how he differed from Smith and Ricardo. Both of them did not really take a very historical approach to understanding these categories, these economic categories. And there's not enough attention, at least given to the notion of primitive accumulation, which is that how did capitalists obtain the means of production. And this Marx argues that it is based on violence and it is not based on any kind of intrinsic merit of any kind. And in fact, I think this notion of primitive accumulation that we find in the last part of Capital Volume 1 is important to understand what is happening today as well. When sometimes for mining, there are certain areas of tribal areas, especially which are being accumulated. So I think that these notions are conceptual ideas are especially important even today. Marx also uses social classes. He doesn't call values as natural prices like Smith or Ricardo, but he terms them prices of production. Marx, similar to Ricardo, argues that the value of a commodity is determined by the labor that goes directly and indirectly into the production of that commodity. And in the literature, there is something called transformation problem. But again, I'm not going to get into detail here, but this is something that can be read up very easily. And before I go on to this slide, sometimes I think as students, you might find it difficult to go through Capital Volume 1, which is a big text. Instead, I would really recommend that you read Wage, Labor and Capital, not Value, Price and Profit, but Wage, Labor and Capital, which was actually a set of 3 lectures that Marx gave. And it contains a lot of essential elements which would figure in Capital Volume 1. So Wage, Labor and Capital, I think, is a good introduction, and it can also be given as readings for students. Marx's theory of income distribution is in a way similar to Smith and Ricardo. In a way, because workers or labor is the one who adds value to the commodities, profit is understood as theft. Because capitalists are basically extracting or exploiting workers and then taking profit. Now, profit is understood to be a theft. Again, at this juncture, it would be useful to compare this notion with the notion that is there in Varian's or Mankiw's Microeconomics or any neoclassical text of microeconomics, where you have the marginal productivity theory of income distribution, where profit is seen as a necessary compensation. And this underlying notion of exploitation or profit as theft notion, which Marx talks about, is completely erased. Students are not even introduced to this kind of a notion. So for Marx, the source of profit or profit really arises from the value that is added by workers. Marx's theory of growth, or broadly, maybe one can say it is a theory of business cycles, and it's not a theory of steady growth, but it is about cyclical growth. He uses these concepts of department 1 and 2, one which produces consumption goods and the other which produces investment goods. Similar to Smith and Ricardo, he also thinks that net accumulation and saving are absolutely important for growth. But what you find in Marx is also a theory of crisis. But remember that for Marx, crisis is not permanent, it's temporary. And in that sense, we can better call it a theory of business cycles. And the reason for crisis is broadly, in the literature, these are the reasons that are provided. One is lack of consumption because workers are not paid adequate wages. It could be a disproportionality, that is between sectors. The growth in this, what one sector needs might not be matched by the other sector. So there is some sort of a disproportionality. And a realization crisis, that is whatever surplus value is being produced, there is insufficient demand for it. So what Marx's theory of crisis really tells us is that there is an important role for demand, and the structure of the capitalist system also has a role to play. Now, what is interesting, at least in economics broadly, is that whenever there is a crisis, whether it was a global financial crisis or any other crisis, then students and teachers, we go back to Marx. But in the regular situation, we do not introduce students to these alternative ways of understanding how the world works. So if I were to now summarize Smith, Ricardo, and Marx and sort of put together, although Marxism political economy has a different trajectory, But I think that there are some common elements between Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, one of which is what is called methodological holism. All of them treat social class as a fundamental unit of analysis. For all of them, prices or values are seen as indices of reproduction of the economic system. They are not indices of scarcity as in marginalist or neoclassical economics. For all of them, usually one distributive variable is exogenous, which is usually wages. And what this really means is that this classical economics is open to history. Unlike neoclassical economics, where wages are also endogenously determined, neoclassical economics is rather ahistorical. Classical economists understand that conflict is structural in nature and there is an explicit recognition of the role of structural power. Again, the structural power is simply absent in neoclassical microeconomics. Unless you are able to introduce it by some sort of imperfections. But in the perfectly competitive economy that neoclassical economics talks about, there is no systematic role for structural power. When you look at the notions of growth that is found in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, one can say that there is some recognition of ecological constraints and there is some recognition of aggregate demand issues. And in all these three economists, it is very, very clear that there is no tendency to the full employment of labor. So what I have kept here is as question answers. Let me just go back. So I think what we can do. Okay, I hope I'm not sharing now. Is the PowerPoint visible? Is the PowerPoint visible?
No, sir, just
Yes, it's so sorry.
question.
Yeah. So what I would suggest now is maybe we can take about questions for maybe now it is 4:04. We can take questions till 4:15, about 11 minutes, and then at 4:15 I will start, and I think I will finish by 4:45. Is that okay? Or I mean, if the organizers think that I can go ahead and then we can have questions at the end, that is also okay.
Is there any question from the floor? If you have any question, please put it on the chat box, or you can ask directly. Okay, sir, we'll go with the session and we'll have the question answer session after the presentation.
Okay. Okay. So, so far we covered the core classical economists, which is Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. Now I'm going to go sort of forward. Now I'm going to talk about Piero Sraffa and I'm going to talk about demand-led growth theory. So Sraffa published his book, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities. Okay, sorry. Is the slide visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Sraffa published his landmark book, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities in 1960. And this book was sort of written in the tradition of classical economics. And what you see in that book is also how he comes to the question of value through exogenous distribution. And this is a phrase that I've taken from Krishna Bharadwaj's review of Sraffa's book, which was published in Economic Weekly, how it was called before Economic and Political Weekly. What this really means, and this goes to what I was talking about in the context of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, that wages were sort of exogenously determined by larger forces of history. So value was determined through exogenous distribution. And Hemant Kumar sir in his presentation spoke about the Cambridge capital controversy theory briefly, and I think this might come up later. But because of that Sraffa's understanding of that issue, in his work, you notice that prices and profit rates are determined simultaneously. Because to determine prices, you need to know the rate of profit. To determine the rate of profit, you need to know the prices. And therefore, both of these have to be determined simultaneously. Sraffa also highlighted some of the problems for marginalist economics or neoclassical economics, which arise from capital theory issues. And in fact, one can ask this problem was also highlighted by Joan Robinson in her famous paper. Basically, the problem arises because of the neoclassical's use of the aggregate production function. And I think this will also be touched upon later tomorrow or day after. For Sraffa, the way in which Sraffa sets up his theory of value is the following. You are able to determine relative prices and rate of profit if you know three things. And these are called givens. One, the size and composition of output. Two, let's say real wages, which is one distributive variable. And three, techniques of production. So if you are able to objectively know these three things, then it is possible to have a coherent and consistent theory of value in the classical tradition. And this is what Sraffa was able to show in his 1960 book. Now let me go to the principle of effective demand. This was put forth in 1936 by Keynes and actually 3 years earlier by Michel Kalecki, a Polish economist, in 1933. Basically, it says that aggregate demand determines aggregate output. And within aggregate demand, you have autonomous elements and induced elements. So it's basically autonomous elements of aggregate demand that have a determining role in aggregate output. And usually when this notion is taught in macroeconomics in the conventional sense, it is said that this operates in the short run, where productive capacity is given. But there's enough literature which shows that you can also think of this principle as operating in the long run. In the long run, when productive capacity has changed, people have argued that it is growth in the elements of growth in autonomous elements of aggregate demand, which determines economic growth. Right? So I think I will talk a little bit more about this because this is not sufficiently discussed in our curriculum or sufficiently written about in general. Although people talk about that demand is important, there seems to be no conceptual framework to really think about this problem. Unemployment, according to the principle of effective demand, is a consequence of aggregate demand deficiency. It is not a consequence of imperfections or stickiness or rigidities of information or expectations like the new Keynesian economics. And this is a very important distinction to make because marginalist economics or neoclassical economics can also talk about unemployment. It is not at all difficult. For neoclassical economics to say that the unemployment exists, all they need to introduce is some sort of imperfection or stickiness or rigidity. And then you can explain unemployment. But that is not how classical economics or Keynesian economics are trying to argue. They're saying unemployment is a consequence of aggregate demand deficiency. So this is broadly the, brief literature of the demand-led growth theory. Again, there are various varieties. I'm just talking about the classical Keynesian variety, which owes itself to Garignani's important articles in 1978 and 79, Franklin Serrano's important piece in 1995, Garignani and Antonella Palumbo in 1998, and I've just listed the other things. In fact, I'd used some of this understanding to sort of critically evaluate the Economic Survey of India 2015 document in EPW, because it is clear that when policymakers are thinking, they're always going back to the mainstream neoclassical aggregate production function kind of supply side growth theory. So in a way, if we want students to have alternative ways of understanding the world, I think it is important to introduce them to supply side growth theory, which is what is Solow, Romer, etc. But also demand led growth theory, which gives a different flavor and a different perspective to understand economic growth. So supply side growth theory is built on the aggregate production function. And if you think that the capital theory critique is devastating, then the use of the aggregate production function is limited. But nevertheless, they argue that a growth in L, which is labor and technology, which are fundamentally supply side factors, they determine economic growth. So there is no problem of aggregate demand deficiency. And this is a question I'm not going to answer, but I'm going to leave you with that. Why does, for instance, in Solow's growth theory, why is there no problem of aggregate demand deficiency? What are the assumptions that ensure that there will be no deficiency of aggregate demand in Solow's growth theory? So let me come closer to what we discuss in India. And there were in 2013 when Amartya Sen and John Brace and Bhagwati and Panagarya published their respective books on economic growth, there was a debate about what the state should do, whether it is important to have redistribution alongside growth, or will growth automatically lead to redistribution. I'm not interested in that debate, but what I want to point out to you here is, if you read both these books carefully, what you notice is all of them essentially rely on the marginless supply side aggregate production function kind of theoretical framework. In other words, both their books can easily be classified in the neoclassical economics tradition. So let me make some conclusions now. Classical economics offers a distinct analytical apparatus to understand our economic surroundings. In other words, it offers us a distinct microeconomics and a distinct macroeconomics. Now, in terms of the curriculum, I think there are broadly two ways in which one can engage with alternative economics or classical political economy. One is it can be introduced within microeconomics and within macroeconomics, and then you can have a debate between marginalist microeconomics and classical political economy within microeconomics itself. That will make the subject come alive. That is one way. Or they have to be introduced as separate courses, like MG University has done. It can be introduced in the form of heterodox economics, but it will just be one small unit. You can have an entire course in classical political economy, which actually exists at the University of Hyderabad. You can have a course on Marxian political economy. And sometimes elements of this are also communicated through a course on the history of economic thought. What this understanding, what heterodox economics in a way tells us is that between theories, there are paradigmatic differences of a fundamental nature. There are also methodological differences, say methodological individualism or methodological holism. Existence of the surplus in the case of classical political economy, and in neoclassical economics, there is no surplus because of the product exhaustion theorem. So there are these fundamental theoretical differences. Now, given the surge of computing power and data, what is the role of empirics? I think that some of these conceptual differences cannot be settled on the basis of empirical data. There is no way in which you can settle fundamental philosophical or ethical or methodological or paradigmatic differences on the basis of empirical data. So in that sense, it is really important for students to be made aware of these pure conceptual or theoretical debates that have taken place in the past. For instance, what determines value? How do we understand Marx's theory of value from the utility theory of value that is there in microeconomics textbooks? No amount of data can really settle this question. And I think this is where a course like heterodox economics can really make us realize the importance for maybe multiple ways of understanding the real world. Now, if I were to look at from the side of policies, I think the knowledge of alternative theories is important. And if you look at, for instance, the economic survey document or other government documents, it is very clear that they are unaware of alternative theories. So, as a student, maybe who has studied heterodox economics and you go on to become an IAS officer or an IES officer, or in the statistical service or in the RBI, I think that you will be aware that there are alternative ways of understanding the world, and this is not the only way. And I think it is also important to recognize the limitations of all these theories. That is about the theoretical aspect of it. But it is also important to recognize that whether it is classical political economy or Keynesian economics or Marxian or neoclassical economics, you cannot readily apply it to the Indian economy because the Indian economic context is very different. We have regional differences, we have issues relating to caste, immobility, gender immobility. So all these issues are there, and so one has to be very careful when it comes to applying any of these theories in the policy domain. We can acquire information about the context either through quantitative ways, which could be simple statistics or maybe some sophisticated econometrics. We should also try to capture and understand the context through ethnography. We should also try to understand the context by longitudinal studies. And what all this points to, and what I think this is what I want to end with really, is that it is important for us to recognize that there are different ways of understanding the world. In other words, there is pluralism of theories and of methods. So there is no reason to favor econometrics over simple statistics. There is no reason to favor econometrics over ethnography. Depending on the problem, I think that many of them would be equally valuable, and the students should be exposed to these multiple ways of making sense of our surroundings. And let me just show a few more slides. Sometimes what this means is the studying of heterodox economics often means unlearning economics, and what I mean really is unlearning the kind of neoclassical economics that we've learned so far. And the right side illustration is just to point out that it is often a struggle. And this is what Keynes also writes, that because we are used to thinking in such set ways that it is quite a struggle to escape and look at new ways of understanding the world. And heterodox economics, I think, gives you that opportunity to look at new ways. So this is just, I like this illustration very much, and this is done by one of my ex-students, and this will figure in the textbook that will be published next year. But the reason I put this here is really this is basically an illustration of Keynes's quotation, where he says that a good economist, be a good philosopher, a mathematician, statesperson, a historian. So it's important to read very widely. As students of economics or as generally as students. In terms of books, I will point out some of them which can be used in this course. So if you want to have a good, rich understanding of the classical context, especially Adam Smith, you can look at Tony Aspromorgos's book called The Science of Wealth. If you want to have a broader understanding of the questions of value and distribution from a classical political economy perspective, you can look at Krishna Bharadwaj's book. And if you want a bit more summary versions of what each of these economists spoke about, you can look at Alessandro Roncaglia's book, The Wealth of Ideas, which is also a very good, it is a big book, but you just need to look at the chapters you are interested in. The other books that you can look at for more specific reasons, one is The Theory of Wages in Classical Economics by Antonella Stirati. The other one, if you're more interested in the labor market, is this book by Antonella Picchio called Social Reproduction. And this book by Kutz and Salvadori puts Understanding Classical Economics, where several articles that they have written over time have been published there. I think that if you're able to access chapters or passages from these 6 books, it will give you a very comprehensive understanding of classical political economy as an alternative approach to understanding our economic surroundings. And I've just mentioned 2 journal articles too, in case you're more interested and because if you want to research in this area or to publish in this area, there are some journals available, and one of them is the European Journal of the History of Economic Thought, and the other is Review of Political Economy. And these are two articles which you can look up if you want to advance your understanding of classical economics further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. It was such an informative talk. Now the participants can ask their queries in the chat box. Okay, sir. So many questions are coming. So Rajesh K have asked that, sir, what the difference between the Smith and Ricardo natural and the market price? How they achieve?
Okay. Okay. Can you just show me where? I mean, can I see the questions directly, or that's not possible? Maybe.
Sir,
Okay, that's okay. That's okay. I'll address it. The main
sir,
difference. Yeah.
So is a chat box available for you in that icon? Then you can see it directly.
Yeah, I was able to see it, but okay, it's not showing me. Okay, it just says that you can't send messages because you're not a member of the chat. Maybe because I don't know. I'll just try and respond. That's okay. I can't access the chat.
Oh, okay, sir.
Between Smith and Ricardo, most of it is similar, but I think the difference is that for Ricardo, the natural price is more tied and much more closely related to the labor theory of value, or an embodied labor theory of value. Whereas for Smith, it is more to do with the labor commanded theory of value. And in Smith, it is the role of effectual demand as a sort of anchor is much more explicit. Whereas for Ricardo, it is not so very clear, at least in his principles of political economy. But analytically speaking, I think that you can say that they're very similar.
Okay, so Bruce J have asked that, do you think there is a tendency in Smith and Ricardo to suppress historical approach?
There is a tendency in Smith and Ricardo to
suppress the historical approach.
So okay. So if you read Marx first, and then let's say you read Smith and Ricardo, sometimes one might get the feeling that because of the way Marx is also very rhetorical and angry, maybe even, that these economists didn't think about it. But it is not quite so, because in their writing, it is true that there is not such an explicit historical account as Marx has done. There is no doubt about it. But Smith is also access to a lot of literature, and he also talks a little bit about what is called the stages theory of history. He tries to engage in something like that. And Ricardo, for that matter, he's also actively involved in policy making and all that. So given their daily functions, there is some historical understanding, but it is true that they do not, I would not say that they match up to the kind of historical approach that one can find in Marx.
Okay, so question from RH. Could you explain why you think of Sen as a neoclassical economist?
Yeah. So the answer is simple, because if you look at his Nobel Prize winning work, what Sen does is he brings understanding of welfare to marginalist economics. He says that we should expand marginal or neoclassical economics to also take care of welfare considerations, but it is completely based on a methodological individualist perspective. So that is one example. Now the other example is if we read his the book Uncertain Glory, it is very clearly written that they have no theoretical disagreements with supply side growth theory or the marginalist growth theory. So the fundamental theoretical framework is that of marginalist economics. So, and I think as Hemant Kumar sir mentioned in the very beginning, you can do heterodox economics, or let's say you can do neoclassical economics and still fall in the politically right or in the politically left spectrum. it is very possible to do that, because you just need to bring in some modifications and adjustments, or you can use a lot of data analysis and say something else. So it's perfectly possible.
Okay, so could you please share your experience in using the economy by core team?
Okay, so I actually haven't used that so much. And when I taught the course here, what I did was I took, there was some some pages I took from core, but I took some pages or extracts from RBI, some from policy documents like the economic survey, some I took passages from Kaletsky, Keynes. So what I did for the students was actually I gave them a printed reader where I had taken extracts and passages from many different sources. So I did not I cannot say that I've really used the core book.
Okay, so and yeah, are these theory not much in mainstream and lack sheen because they are redundant? Where can we put economics history among this hierarchy of economic thought?
Yeah. Okay. So. Well, okay, this is what at least some of us think, that the reason why some of these theories are not there, for instance, whether it is Marx or Ricardo, is because they ask some very difficult and unsettling questions. They also point out that there is a structural power conflictual relationship between capitalists and workers, and it I mean, it calls for some sort of maybe politics and policy which is a bit um, maybe, for lack of a better word, maybe radical compared to mainstream economics. Because in mainstream economics, everything is, at least in the margin productivity theory perfect competition way, everything is just. There is no sense of injustice there, because everybody is paid what they are contributing. But if you are introduced to Smith or Ricardo or Marx, it is clear that is not the case. What really comes up is the role of power. And the question is, why is it that for some reason textbooks have censored, maybe consciously or unconsciously or intentionally or unintentionally, the contributions of people like Marx or Ricardo to economic theory? And why is it that we do not teach our students these questions which are unsettling?
Okay, so and please explain Kaletsky Keynes Safra synthesis on theory of capital.
Okay, so I don't think there is a Kaletsky Keynes Rafa synthesis on the theory of capital. The sort of synthesis happens in the context of growth theory, where what is taken is the principle of effective demand from Kaletsky and Keynes, because both of them have essentially more or less similar notions of principle of effective demand. And you have the theory of value, which is a revival of classical theory of value in Sraffa. And demand-led growth theory basically uses this classical or Sraffa theory of value and the principle of effective demand from Kaletsky and Keynes to come up with the demand-led growth theory.
Yeah, so one last question. What would microeconomics look like in heterodox economics?
Okay. Okay. So the way so again, I think you cannot say that there is, because heterodox economics is multiple economics. So, for instance, if somebody, let me rephrase that question, I can tell you what I would think of as a classical political economy microeconomics. So, I would start by talking about methodological holism, that you start from social classes. One can talk about primitive accumulation and the structural ideas of power. You can talk about wages as being determined as a historical and a cultural magnitude. And you can talk about the inverse relationship between wages and rate of profit. There is also work on firm theory, competition theory in this tradition. So I think there is enough literature. I mean, essentially, you are explaining the same things, but the conceptual framework, the vocabulary, the explanatory mechanisms are very different. And most importantly, you will not find a tendency to full employment in classical political economy, as you would find in neoclassical economics.
Okay, so Santosh is saying that, but in many of the works of Sen, he theoretically argues for redistribution or redistributive justice, which goes counter to one of the very important premises of neoclassical economics. For instance, the implicit assumption that there exists a proper state of distribution.
Yeah, so let me just respond to that. So, what neoclassical economics really talks about is, I mean, when you have equilibrium prices, all it says is that it is Pareto efficient. That is the only thing it says. And neoclassical economists would also say that the question of equity cannot be understood by that, because the endowments are given. Endowments are one of the data of the system. So if the endowments are unequal, then you might have an efficient outcome, but it might not be equitable in any sense. So even within the neoclassical framework, you can talk about equitable distribution. There is nothing stopping you from talking about equitable distribution, because you have assumed that these the distributive the endowments are given to you. So if there is inequality of endowments, you can have an inequality in the outcomes, and that is where as a neoclassical economist, you can argue that you need to have a redistribution of endowments.
If anybody wants to ask the question directly to the speaker, then they can proceed.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you, Alex, for a very good presentation that you have made for the last 1.5 hour. It's a very interesting presentation, and you have started from Adam Smith to one of the latest developments in not only in neoclassical economics but in development theories as well. But I just want to know that, see, it's possible that for whatever be the initial distribution of endowments, according to that, the market mechanism will adjust and we will get appropriate results. But neoclassical economics is patently not talking about this initial state of income distribution. Then who will take care of that income distribution? So actually, as you rightly pointed out, when you change the initial state of distribution, the results will also change. But neoclassical economics is totally not analyzing that particular position. So which means that, and this is one of the main criticisms leveled by the heterodox economics. So they argue that once we consider this particular aspect, we cannot explain the real world situation. So we have to make interventions into that initial state of distribution, or we need to have redistribution. And Amartya Sen patently or powerfully argues for redistribution. Then my doubt is, then how we can straitjacket Amartya Sen into the framework of neoclassical economics?
Okay. All right. So okay. So I think that, so one is that it is true that you can talk. I mean, I still stick to what I said before, that you can have you can be an economist who is a neoclassical economist and still be fair and talk about redistribution if you have welfare considerations which are, well, if your welfare considerations are greater than your efficiency considerations. All it means is that we cannot just go by efficiency considerations. You need to have a welfare consideration in mind. And what what Amartya Sen has done is to really highlight that welfare consideration within the domain of neoclassical economics. And that is certainly a big thing, because that was not an important consideration. So, but also, I'm not saying that neoclassical economics is bad, or my dissatisfaction with neoclassical economics does not come from the question of redistribution. It comes from two things. Two, I feel, are theoretical issues. One is their belief in the marginal productivity theory of income distribution. And two, their assumption that there is a tendency to the full employment of labor. And both of these are in a way coming up And the classical economics or SRAFA is able to, I mean, they are the ones who level this critique through the Cambridge Capital controversy. So my dissatisfaction, I don't have any dissatisfaction with neoclassical economics on the question of redistribution of income. For me, it is really the marginal productivity theory of income distribution and the tendency to the full employment of labor. And also, so I'm not trying, also, when I say that, I don't mean to say that neoclassical economists are bad people or their politics is different, anything like that. It's just that conceptually, I have a dissatisfaction. Politically, it might be a different thing.
No, I want to clarify that I am not painting that neoclassical economics are bad analysts. I'm just pointing out that this fundamental assumption, that's all. And they have made tremendous contribution, and we are all following the framework of neoclassical economics. That is true. But with respect to this particular aspect, they are totally silent. It is that actually makes our discipline unable to explain many of the real world problems faced by the economy. That is what I gather when I read the contributions of many heterodox approaches in economics.
True. But it is very true that I think it is heterodox economics which has given more importance and more voice to the questions of redistribution than neoclassical economics. That's true.
Hello, may I ask a doubt?
Sure.
So my name is Ankin. I'm a graduate student. Earlier, you'd made references to substitutes for microeconomics within the heterodox space. Could you elaborate on how we could get access to those resources?
Are you talking about the material that I shared or what I said in response to a question?
So what you said in response to a question.
Okay. So I'm okay. Those are broadly based on my own teaching, but what I can refer you to is this book in the post-Keynesian tradition. This is not in the classical Keynesian tradition, but in the post-Keynesian tradition, there is a book by Frederick Lee, who has written a book called Heterodox Microeconomics.
Okay.
And if you want a more classical economics point, I would ask you to look at Krishna Bharadwaj's work.
Okay.
So it's not explicitly packaged as microeconomics, but you can find elements of microeconomics in Krishna Bharadwaj's work and in some of the work that I've already shared already. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, I think that's all for our question answer session. Thank you, Alexa, for giving your valuable time.
Okay. Can I add something more? Just one minute.
Yeah, sir. Yes, sir. Please.
Just 1 minute. See, somebody asked a question regarding there are heterodox microeconomic theories. Of course, there are heterodox microeconomic theories. For example, let's see market pricing theory and its elaborations by many subsequent post-Keynesian economists. Then target rate of return pricing, financial theories of the firm. So if you want, you can download an exclusive book called post-Keynesian heterodox microeconomic theory. And if you want an old textbook, I can give you the reference with regard to a book published in the 1980s by an Italian economist named Stefano Zamagni. See, this is the book, Stefano Zamagni, Microeconomic Theory, an Introduction, and it was published by Basil Blackwell, year of publication 1987, an excellent early book explaining micro value distribution theory from a Sraffian, Ricardian, and Marxian framework. One of the, I often think why best books are not recommended in the syllabus, why best books are not popular. Mankey's or some others, Pissarrites, Pindix books, they are recommended in our syllabus. And students are familiar with only those books, mainstream books. This is a very, very important work done by an Italian economist, Stefano Zamagni. And nearly 100 or 150 pages are devoted to the revival of what Dr. Alex Thomas has stated about the classical value and distribution theory. And he explains micro principles based purely on Straussian lines. We know that Strauss was a great critic of the neoclassical Marshallian theory. And this is a very good book. See, this was only one point I can add to this excellent talk. And I benefited a lot of fresh and new information from your talk, Dr. Alex Thomas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Actually, this thank you for the reference, because I didn't know about this book by Zamagni, so I will go and look it up. Thank you for that.
Okay, thank you so much. That's all for today's session. Thank you, Alexa, for giving your valuable time for us. Thank you so much. For the vote of thanks, I call upon Sumi KS, Research Scholar and Assistant Professor of SSB College. Welcome, ma'am.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. You are audible.
Okay. Respectful resource person of the day, Dr. Alex M. Thomas, Dr. Srija S., and all other dignitaries. A very warm good evening to all. My duty here is to express vote of thanks to you all. Firstly, I express my sincere thanks to Dr. Alex M. Thomas, today's resource person, who had given a very fruitful and informative session on classical political economy, theories of value, distribution, and growth in a very interesting manner. On behalf of the Research and PG Department of Economics and all those who have gathered here, and on my own behalf, I express my heartfelt thanks to you, sir. I also extend my sincere thanks to Srija ma'am, HOD, Research and PG Department of Economics, for initiating such an effort to conduct this webinar. Thank you, ma'am. Prasad sir, the organizer of the webinar, chooses a very relevant topic for discussion. I also express my sincere thanks to you, sir. I also would like to express my thanks to Alia Nasreen, PG student, for successfully moderating the session. Thank you, Alia. I also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to all the teachers, students, and all other participants for your support and coordination. I also express my gratitude to the Department of Economics for giving me this opportunity. Once again, I express my sincere thanks to all. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, please, sir. Thank you so much for your valuable time. Next session will be continued tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Thank you for your participation. Once again, have a nice day.